Good afternoon, colleagues, friends. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, sunny afternoon here in Johannesburg today, to have a really interesting discussion regarding BRICS expansion, South African strategic insights, and future trajectories. My name is Gustavo de Carvalho. I'm a senior researcher on African governance and diplomacy at the South African Institute of International Affairs. And it's really a pleasure here today to welcome you and to uh, lead some of these discussions, a very engaging discussions, what we're expecting about BRICS. And I think we've had an increasing attention towards BRICS in the last couple of years with uh, if we look back from 2009, when BRICS was created as a group, to 2011, when South Africa was invited to join BRICS as part of the first expansion, to the many years and discussions and the creation of institutions like the New Development Bank. And certainly 2023 was quite an eventful year for BRICS. For us here in South Africa, it was eventful because it was the 15th summit that BRICS has organized. South Africa was chairing the group in 2023, and the summit was held in Johannesburg at the Sandton Convention Center in August last year. But beyond that, I think BRICS also brought a number of important discussions in terms of how the group is expected to evolve in the coming years, what its role within a rapidly changing global order, and what are some of the contributions that the group can play in terms of its own members, but also to the broader global governance issues. Today, we're going to have a different type of webinar to what we are accustomed to. So we've decided that instead of having a webinar where we have speakers sharing presentations and in a panel format, we thought of changing that slightly and to try to engage more in a conversation. And I couldn't have asked for better panelists and speakers than what we have today. We have here today with us Ambassador Aniu Suklo. He is an ambassador at large on Asia and BRICS at the South African Department of International Relations and Cooperation. Ambassador Suklo is also the Sherpa, or the South African emissary for BRICS, for IBSA, the India, Brazil, and South Africa, and for the Indian Ocean Association, Indian Ocean Rim Association as well. We also have here with us Sanusha Naidu, who is a very well-known political analyst from South Africa that has been working extensively on BRICS. Both of us were bumping into one another very often last year during the BRICS summit, and some of the few researchers that were sitting there and trying to make sense of all of those rapid developments. Just to briefly explain to you, I see we have over 100 participants here at Zoom at the moment, and we are also streaming that live. For those of you that are here at Zoom and you'd like to make comments or you'd like to ask questions, please use the Q&A function and ask those, make your comments throughout the event. I think we normally, in traditional webinars, we normally wait until the end to get your comments or questions, but I think it would be useful for us to have a sense of what are the thinking in the room, in the virtual room. We are planning to engage in this conversation for around an hour, and if possible, open the floor for some comments at the end as well for a couple of minutes to get some insights and comments from you. But what I wanted to do, maybe start with this conversation with Ambassador Suklo and Sanusha, is to perhaps start with going back to basics. And we here at SAIA, we often providing briefings to local actors, to members of the diplomatic communities, to think tank members and academics. And I feel that at times we spend a lot of time explaining what is BRICS and explaining what BRICS is not. And perhaps, and especially in the last couple of years with this increasing attention that BRICS has received, To a certain extent, I think it's more important than ever for us to reflect on what is the nature of this group. And maybe I wanted to start with you, Ambassador. So if you could maybe start just telling us maybe a bird's eye view about what is BRICS, and maybe what are some of the misconceptions that we often can hear about what BRICS is and what BRICS is not.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Gustavo, and also to my good colleague, Sanusha, and to all of the colleagues on the platform. Let me thank Saya, first of all, for arranging this webinar. I think it's very pertinent and it's a good follow-up following the chairship of South Africa and to reflect on what transpired in 2023 under South Africa's chairship. You know, I think it's important that when we speak of BRICS to understand that BRICS did not come together as a group all of a sudden. There was many processes prior to BRICS launching as a informal group. Firstly, at the level of foreign ministers in 2006, and then at summit level since 2009, with South Africa then joining in 2011. Following the economic global financial crisis, 2008, you saw the G20 being elevated from the level of a ministerial to a summit level meeting, and it has been meeting since. Given the crisis that we had, there has been, especially on the side of South Africa, thinking for a long period of time, and this started under President Mbeki, that we needed a collective and cohesive voice of the Global South, that we do not have such a platform. And South Africa, we tried during the Mbeki era to put together such a platform, but the geopolitical environment, especially the events of 9/11, impacted on this initiative. But for a long time, President Mbeki was of the view that the Global South continues to be marginalized because we don't have a cohesive platform, a collective platform, like the G7 or what was still then G8 had, and that we are constantly not in the mainstream of addressing global events, and issues pertaining to the developing world is constantly on the margins. So it was within this context that we launched IPSA in 2003. And I think the coming together, very often I think we give undue credit to Goldman Sachs, Jim O'Neill. Of course, he coined the term BRIC. But I think, as I've indicated, if you look at the history of the Global South wanting to have a formal platform, bringing like-minded countries together that champion issues that pertains to the Global South, and also issues on the global platform in terms of bringing about reforms. So the coming together of BRICS, as I indicated, first as foreign ministers and subsequently at summit level, and with South Africa joining, you brought together 5 diverse countries. And I emphasize diverse because this is the strength of BRICS. BRICS is not a homogeneous whole. And I think the very heterogeneity of BRICS is part of its strength. That you brought very influential countries from Asia, China and India, and a leading country from Latin America and Brazil. And of course, having China, India, and then bringing a European country that more Eurasian country as Russia seems to want to define itself today, was a collective coming together of very influential countries from the Global South. And you must also understand that at the dawn of the new millennium, the World Bank report of 1998 already cited that countries that should be on the watch list included all of these BRICS countries. Indonesia was included in that report as well, in terms of what was happening on the economic front, that these countries were seen as breakout nations and that they should be put on the watch list. And this is where I think Jim O'Neill focused on what was happening, at least on the economic front on these countries. But the need was there because since the formation of the G7, in 95, still G6, 75, the global agenda setting, given the increasing marginalization of multilateral institutions, the global agenda setting was dominated by the meeting of the G7, subsequently G8. And issues pertaining to the global south was not of concern to these countries. And that is why, if you look at the history of outreach that began with the G8 in 2001 at the Okinawa summit, it was the African countries that went and knocked on the doors of the G8 to say that we want to dialogue with you, to address our development challenges. And that's how the outreach started with the G8. It was Africa that went there. They took the initiative, the three presidents specifically, Thabo Mbeki, Bouteflika, and Meles Zenawi, that went and met as tasked by the OAU then to go and have this interaction with the G8 pertaining to the development needs of Africa specifically. So I'm saying that if you look at the context of the formalizing of a global South body, which is what the BRICS is, it culminated after a long series of events that necessitated us coming together. And of course, when they did launch, not having an African presence, you couldn't call yourself as a global body that's championing the interests of the global South without an African voice. And therefore, as much as South Africa started lobbying in 2010 that we would like, the BRICS countries themselves wanted an African presence in BRICS. And I think with the joining of South Africa, BRICS was further strengthened and found greater legitimacy in terms of championing the cause of the developing world. So I think this is basically, in a nutshell, the evolution of BRICS. And BRICS has, since the past 15 years, since we've been meeting at summits, it's no longer just about the 5 countries. So as I was saying, with the expansion of BRICS, very often we are asked, will the name change? But the acronym is not about the 5 countries anymore. When you think of BRICS, it's far larger than just 5 countries, and the acronym is more a brand name today of the Global South, a group that is engrossed in addressing the fault lines that exist in the global geopolitical, geosecurity, financial, economic architecture as a collective, and doing so in a far more powerful and coherent way as a collective, which none of us, including China as the second largest economy, China also recognizes that we need to act as a group. We as South Africa also recognize that if we want to champion not just our own positions, but that of the African continent, we need a cohesive, powerful platform. And I think that's what BRICS has become in these past 15 years. And you saw the results of that with the avalanche of applications we had in terms of wanting to become BRICS members. Let me stop there, Gustavo, for now.
This is great, Ambassador, and thank you for providing us this overview. I think it's very helpful for everyone in terms of getting a sense of where BRICS came from. And I wanted to turn to you, Sanusha, and maybe jump into 2023, which was a particularly eventful year within BRICS. There were discussions and decisions regarding the expansion. There was the 7 countries effectively that were invited to join BRICS from Egypt, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, United Arab Emirates, Argentina, and we shouldn't forget Indonesia was also invited at that time. And then eventually Argentina and Indonesia declined. I think I will later talk to Ambassador about the situation of Saudi Arabia, which is still raises many questions at the moment. But there were some other decisions taken there too regarding currencies, issues regarding some kind of an infrastructure of trade. BRICS is not a trade bloc, but it talks about some of those opportunities. And maybe if you could reflect for us a little bit in terms of What are you thinking in terms of what were some of the main achievements of the BRICS process in 2023? I don't think just the BRICS summit. What are some of the highlights, and maybe some of your thoughts regarding how some of those decisions can potentially impact the future of the group and its influence in global affairs?
Oh, thank you very much, Gustavo. Firstly, also let me reiterate my thanks, my appreciation for the invitation again to be part of I think what has been a very important discussion and being part of the platform with yourself, but also with Ambassador Suklal, and for Ambassador Suklal providing us with a very important historical evolution of the BRICS and how it came to be and why it's such a strategic platform for the Global South. I think, in a sense, to continue where Ambassador left off, I think that evolution is the culmination in 2023 in terms of a number of institutional issues, but also the kind of technical questions, but also the kind of platform that the BRICS had essentially became as a block and an identity of the Global South in terms of the theme that the BRICS kind of underpinned with regard to this whole question of the multilateral order, the reforming of that order, but also the inclusiveness of that order in terms of power, in terms of development, but also in terms of voice and agency, which is quite critical in the context of what Ambassador Suklal mapped out for us. And I think that culmination being the 15th BRICS summit actually starts in that second cycle of the BRICS summit from 2014 to 2018, and then moving into 2019 as the third cycle is important, because I think it then starts to talk about this institutionalization of a cohesiveness, of an identity, but also the collaboration and the collective engagement that the BRICS would define in the context of the Global South. I think what's also important is the question around that the BRICS represents an important kind of platform for the Global South, but in itself, not the only platform for the Global South. Within the BRICS itself, it has different subgroupings. You still have IPSA, and I think if IPSA is the incubator of the of the BRICS, then you cannot ignore how important it remains as a grouping within the BRICS, but also within the Global South. The Indian Ocean Room, that's very important in the context of the regional blocks, but also the kind of institutional architecture of the Global South. So I think invariably, this is one genesis of how the Global South evolves, and that the Global South in itself is also earmarked by this diversity that that Ambassador Suklal had mentioned. So I think the culmination was really, where does the BRICS go? Does it remain this B5 of the Global South, the core, or does it start to expand? And that in itself is a critical question, because the challenge, I think, within the expansion of the BRICS is really about, does the BRICS identity in the Global South, does it remain static, or does it remain much more evolutionary in the representation of voice and agency? And can it just be that it represents the Global South? And I think that's why expansion is so interesting. And that was one of the key culminations in 2023 in bringing the countries that you saw, or the applications that countries made, in terms of what were the applications, who applied, and why they applied. And we debated this a lot, Gustavo, on the sidelines of the BRICS summit, in the run-up to the summit, in different fora, around what does expansion mean? Is it about changing the dynamics of the international architecture, or is it about inclusion and changing the power dynamics of an international architecture? And I think the expansion question raised a number of, not challenges, but raised a number of institutional questions of the BRICS. Does it now start to coalesce collectively as a formalized bloc with a secretariat, with a kind of headquarters somewhere, or does it remain this floating rotational presidency between 5 countries? How would the new members be defined in terms of their power? You know, is it consensus, but is there some level in which consensus also means that the core members retain some level of power over the consensus decision-making process? What would be the value proposition of the new countries coming in? and so forth. And I think these became institutional questions around, does the BRICS now need to start coalescing itself, institutionalizing itself? And the key question there is really, does it have institutions outside of the heads of state platform, like the New Development Bank, where the New Development Bank becomes the key kind of institutional architecture and the outcome of what the BRICS want. So it can retain a level of flexibility and fluidity at the heads of state, but its institutions like the bank, like the contingency reserve arrangement, like the question of the currency payment in local currency format, not creating a BRICS currency, but using the currencies of the other countries as a kind of payment within local currency. Are those the outcomes of what an institutionalization of the BRICS are? So does it have to be the kind of group identity you see where there has to be a secretariat, there has to be a headquarters? It doesn't have to do that. It can actually use institutions in terms of how it formalizes itself informally. And I think that was very interesting for me at the summit. The expansion, I think, raised a few questions. It raised questions about how did the selection criteria come about? And I think Ambassador Suklal can also give us a little bit more insight around the countries that were eventually invited to join on the 1st of January. And most importantly, how that was then defined by a consensus-led approach within the BRICS. And with all of that kind of understanding of whether there needs to be a kind of approach of how we see institution building in the international arena based on the UN system, based on the international financial institutions. Do we have to then say, this is where we take our kind of point of departure for the BRICS? Do they have to do the same thing? You've got regional associations, you've got ASEAN, you've got IORA, you've got the regional blocks in the Asia Pacific region, or in the what we call Indo-Pacific now. We've got all of these the global South institutions at a regional level. Do we need to recast those institutions, and the BRICS needs to take on a formal identity? So those are interesting dynamics for me. What I think was critical around the space that Ambassador spoke about, the acronym and the brand of BRICS of the Global South, was really the question of what would a BRICS-infused global order look like? Not necessarily a BRICS-centric global order. And I think two things became critical for me as I was thinking about this topic and thinking about where are we going, or what are we looking at, is the timeframes from 2009 to 2023, from the first kind of formalization of the BRICS summit at a heads of state level to 2023 at the end of the third cycle of the BRICS. The world has fundamentally shifted from a systems level approach. It's no longer that world of the financial crisis. In between there, we've had a pandemic, the COVID-19, which changed the architecture at the domestic level for many of the BRIC countries. We just have to look at China and what is happening domestically, economically in China. There's some kinds of challenges that people have raised that, is now China getting into its own kind of financial crisis with the property market bubble, with what's going on with regard to the production and so forth. So I think these are the new kinds of issues that the BRICS in itself will have to start thinking about, because the world is not necessarily just changing, it's rampantly changing. And the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report is very interesting for the time frame of where we are in the BRICS from 2023 to 2024. And what's interesting is that if the Goldman Sachs and the World Bank, the IMF World Bank report actually says that the BRICS are the next kind of global growth pole for the international system, well, now we're reaching a point where economics is now being replaced by geopolitics, and the geopolitics of conflict, both intrastate and interstate, and regionalization of conflict. And so these are important points in terms of what is the index of the BRICS in terms of stability, in terms of prosperity, social cohesion, social dynamics, socioeconomic challenges. Are they ready to take those levels to the next point in terms of their evolution? And I want to stop there because I think these are fundamental points in terms of the factors, the drivers, and the vectors for the BRICS going forward.
Ambassador, I wanted to bring this point that Sanusha mentioned in terms of the process that leads to the expansion and some of the thinking around the very thinking about the identity of the group in terms of course, South Africa being the chair of BRICS in 2023 played an important role in the months preceding the BRICS summit in terms of criteria, in terms of thinking around not just about which countries would come, but what types of countries constitute this idea of an expanded BRICS. So I was wondering if you could maybe just reflect a little bit in terms of the process, in terms of the criteria that were thought about, the interactions between members, and potentially some of the key issues that eventually contributed to the identification of those first 7 countries. But also, I know that BRICS is going to be quite busy this year thinking about a potential new expansion or even issues about partner countries too.
Well, I think, Gustavo, it's important to ask the question, why expansion? Why did BRICS need to expand? And I think this has already come up in the discussions that BRICS has not remained static. It's a dynamic grouping. And also functioning in a fast evolving world, you cannot afford to remain static. You could not afford to remain as a closed group, because from the very outset, BRICS made it clear that we are not a closed group, that we are open to discussions with other countries and other regional bodies. And that is why we started an outreach very early. And South Africa was the architect of the first outreach during the 2013 summit, which was just the 5th summit. Now, I alluded earlier on that it took the G8 25 years to start dialogue with countries outside of the G8 family. And that was brought about on the initiative of those from the outside, in this case, Africa. In the case of BRICS, we recognize that we need to have an interactive relationship with the countries of the South. And firstly, since the summit was in Africa, we felt that it was important that we engage Africa during our chairship. And of course, subsequently, we brought in BRICS Plus, and we have been in dialogue. And the number of countries increasingly wanting to dialogue with BRICS from the global South expanded. And in the process, as these countries started interacting with us, they started knocking on the door and saying, yes, we don't just want to dialogue, we want to become full members. So in 2018, this issue arose during our chairship of BRICS in 2018. In fact, we put out the first discussion paper on expansion prior to the 2018 summit. As we were working towards our chairship, we also raised the issue of expansion. And the first discussion paper on expansion we put out. But in 2018, the leaders felt it was premature to start looking at expanding BRICS. But of course, by the time we came to 2023, the decision was already taken under China's chairship in 2022, because increasingly countries were saying we want to become part of the family. And that is why we started on the process as guided by the leaders at the 2022 summit to start working out guiding principles, standards, and criteria for expansion. And that is what we did for the first half of our chairship last year at the Sherpa Sous-Sherpa level, was to try and finalize this document. And by the time foreign ministers met, we had already over 20 countries formally requesting to become BRICS members, and an equal number of countries informally showing interest in joining BRICS. So you're looking at a list of over 40 countries. And therefore, we were tasked by the foreign ministers to expedite and finalize the criteria so that we could then take recommendations to the leaders at the summit in terms of the mandate given in 2022 on expansion. Now, of course, very often we are asked, how did the process unfold? How did you choose the original 7 countries? Indonesia was on the list, you correctly observed, or 8 countries that were there that we zoomed in on. It was a combination. It was a combination of the guiding document, the guiding principles, as well as a political decision in terms of who ultimately we brought in. There were a number of factors, including regional representation, that was important. And that is why for South Africa, it was important that we strengthen Africa's presence within BRICS. If we were expanding, we needed to have more than just South Africa as an African member of BRICS. So the guiding principle document is on our website. It's quite detailed. And that was the base document which guided the foreign ministers and subsequently the leaders in determining which of these members we bring in. Of course, Indonesia had shown great interest of wanting to join, but on the eve of the summit, they did inform us that since they are going into a general election and they've just completed that election, they would rather wait for the elections before determining joining BRICS. They would have naturally been an addition to BRICS that everyone would have welcomed. All BRICS countries were quite happy to have Indonesia join the family. Argentina, I think we know the history there with the change of government, and they decided to withdraw. Now, in the case of Saudi Arabia has not yet formally sent in a letter indicating that they're joining, nor have they said no. And I think there are various factors. What they have communicated to us and also to the Russian BRICS Sherpa is that they are busy with internal processes at the moment, and they require time. And I think given the dynamics within that region as well, I think Saudi Arabia should be given the space in terms of making a determination. But as indicated, Saudi Arabia was one of those countries that were quite serious about wanting to be part of the BRICS family. So I think Saudi Arabia will eventually make up its mind, and we are still hopeful because they have participated in some meetings. They did participate in the last Sherpa meeting when we invited all the new members in Durban in December. And they were not at the first Sherpa meeting in Moscow 2 weeks ago, but they did participate virtually in 2 Sherpa meetings under Russia's presidency in January. So you can see that there is still some level of participation from Saudi Arabia going forward. I think the countries that we eventually settled on, I think it was important to bring a presence from West Asia into the equation. We wanted another Latin American country, and therefore the choice of Argentina. And we wanted also representation from the African continent. And we are pleased that both Egypt and Ethiopia lobbied heavily to want to become a member. Very often we are asked the question, why is Nigeria not part of BRICS? But we could only make a determination from those countries that formally approached BRICS to become members. And Nigeria was not on that list.
Ambassador, perhaps if I can just do a follow-up question on that, and I'm looking into some of the questions and comments that our participants are sharing here. One of the questions here, it's asking specifically about the benefits for South Africa in terms of the expansion, but I think it brings an interesting point, precisely this question that I think it was kind of floating around throughout 2023, whether an expansion wouldn't be a dilution of the influence of existing members. And I would say perhaps particularly for the smaller members within the group. But also I think it comes with the broader question around, and maybe going back into the selection criteria that perhaps is the very concept of global south in that sense. That a lot of the questions we are receiving here are asking about, does it make sense, for instance, to say the countries like China or Russia are part of the global south? What is the global south in that sense? from a BRICS perspective?
Well, look, very often this question is asked, what is the global south? I don't think it's a geographical term. It's beyond that. The global south is a political term. Well, and when I say a political term, it's a group of countries that identify with our common challenges and seeks to advance these challenges on the global platform in ensuring that there's a more equitable, representative, fair, and just global governance architecture at all levels. And this is what the Global South is about. And I think when we speak loosely of the Global South, we all understand each other. I think trying to put an academic definition to the Global South is a wasted exercise, because it's, as I've said, it's beyond a geographical term. It's a political term that is used today. I very often ask, why don't we ask what is the global north? We also speak of the global north, but we know that the north is about the developed world and the south is about the developing world, and including all of us that feels marginalized continue to be outliers in terms of what's happening in the evolving global architecture. And we want to be at the forefront in changing this. And I think as Sanusha rightfully observed, it's not about us dominating a new global architecture, that whatever form it may take, but us being part of creating that and ensuring that as we are the architects of this, that we contribute meaningfully in terms of addressing all of the fault lines that impacts on us first and foremost. And I think that's important to understand when we speak of the Global South. Very often when the question is raised, is Russia a country of the Global South? But as I said, it's not about a geographical term. It's far more than that. And I think these are the issues that we need to be mindful of. Dilution, I'm very often asked this question, as you expand, do you dilute? Now, when there was a push for the African Union to become a full member of the G20, I was asked the question, wouldn't this dilute South Africa's influence within the G20 as being the only African member? And I said, no. On the contrary, it will strengthen our hand. It will strengthen the presence of Africa, having the African Union there. The European Union being part of the G20 doesn't dilute the EU members' presence there. But actually, if you see the way the EU coordinates and the way the EU member states work with the EU office within the G20, I think there's lessons for us there as Africa. And as South Africa and the African Union, I believe we can be just as effective. We don't have the same numbers, of course, within the G20. So there's no dilution. Now, in the case of BRICS, bringing in these new members, all of them come with the strengths. All of them, and one of the criteria that we do outline in our document, you must subscribe to the principles and values that the BRICS stand for. And all of them do. In fact, this was something that they had to adhere to in becoming full members. When President Ramaphosa wrote to all of these countries, inviting them to become full members, we attached the guiding principles, standard, and criteria document, which they are bound to subscribe to. So that makes it very clear that all of them share the values that BRICS has been championing thus far, and they want to associate themselves with it. So I think it strengthens the voice of BRICS, and it strengthens the economic clout of BRICS. I mean, you would have just seen recently that BRICS grew at a faster pace than the G7 collectively. And the size of the BRICS economies is, from a GDP point of view, is bigger than that of the G7 and will continue to grow. So BRICS has become an influential platform, not just in terms of its growing economic, financial might. And that's why we have been tasked by the leaders under paragraph 45 of the Johannesburg II Declaration to look at the issue of local currency and payment instrument and platform and report by the next summit. Now, throughout last year, there was always this issue in the public domain that BRICS is anti-dollar, and we're trying to set up a currency that is against the dollar. And that was just total misinformation. It's about us looking at alternatives in terms of how we conduct our financial transactions, how we conduct our trade between ourselves and between our partners globally, not just global South, global North. And this is something that the African Union is seized with. It's something that countries of the global South increasingly are adopting their own payment system, their payment platform and instruments. They're increasingly deciding to trade in their own currencies, all of which we have been discussing in BRICS for a number of years. It just didn't crop up as part of the agenda last
year. And I wanted to bring some of these points to you, Sanusha, and to get your take, particularly on the decision-making process within BRICS. And I think you spoke a little bit about this informal, formal dichotomy within BRICS. I think Ambassador mentioned a lot of the process that took place, a lot of the thinking around that. But how do you think that the expansion will have an impact in terms of broader decision-making processes within BRICS, particularly, and as I think Ambassador mentioned, the issue of values within BRICS. And I think when we watch many of those BRICS meetings, when we talk to people working on BRICS, the issue of consensus often comes up as quite an important, not only just a value, but a way of conducting business. And how do you think these new members will have an implication on that?
Yeah, I think what Ambassador has laid out for us is very important in terms of the guiding document, in terms of expansion criteria. But still, the idea is as expansion moves to further expansion. So in this year, you're going to find that with Russia, there's going to be that discussion, and perhaps even looking at countries in the Eurasian regional dynamic of how they may be possible candidates that will make formal requests or applications to join. So it's not a static position. It's not a static process. It's an ongoing process. And if it's an ongoing process, as I'm interpreting it, then of course the kind of criteria has to also evolve in that context. It's important to also see that in terms of the collective economic GDP strength, etc., of the group, that in one respect, that's very important. But when it comes to consensus, I think one of the points that I want to pick up on is that the Global South is a political context, a political construction. And of course, this then raises a point for me in terms of the expansion of the BRICS is how long does it retain that economic identity and starts to move to that political identity, the geopolitics of where we are now in the context of the international system. Because the international system is increasingly becoming the kind of geopoliticization of the economic architecture of the international system, with the trade issues, with the questions of what we are seeing in the context of conflict, and how conflict is evolving. And it's not just about interstate conflict, it's also intrastate conflict. And of course, these are going to be important vectors. So I think the challenge or the question I have is, what does consensus mean going forward? Are they going to be a kind of 5 core issues, broad political, economic issues that will be, this is where consensus will be derived from? And that would mean that there will be consensus on that it's unequivocal that all members of the core members of the BRICS, and including the new members that join, and I'd be interested to hear about one of the outcomes from the Johannesburg summit last year was that the foreign ministers were tasked about building a model on partner countries that want to be part of the BRICS, how that model will work. So will you have a kind of inner core and an outer core of the BRICS? And is there a kind of, a ring in the middle, an intermediate ring of countries in terms of how the layers of the BRICS will work in terms of the inner, intermediate, and the outer? And so will they be core issues that are essentially things like reform of the UN Security Council, expansion of reform of the multilateral order, inclusion of countries that are beginning to move on their GDP, in their voting rights in the IMF, like what the Chinese have been able to push in terms of the equal voting rights on the IMF, questions around how would this work in terms of certain core issues with the WTO. So there may be 5 or 6 or even 7 or 8 core issues where consensus can be achieved for the BRICS. But then when it comes to critical issues around, for example, regional dynamics, where conflict starts to spill over, how do you deal with that? Is there consensus there? What will be the criteria that defines consensus when it starts to peel away from what are the basic core issues for the reform of the multilateral order? And that seems to be that kind of understanding that the system needs to be democratized, that the system needs to be inclusive, and it needs to have much more voice and agency for new actors and change the power dynamics of the international order, which is no longer reflecting a changing and a rapidly evolving international system. So is the system still fit for purpose? Perhaps it is for some countries, perhaps it's not for others, but the point is that it's no longer static for anybody. And so what will be that criteria? When will conflict over, for example, if one of the countries that you have now formally invited joins, but objects to another country from joining? What will be the consensus building there? And will consensus, in terms of the value proposition that the strength of the BRICS is its diversity, in other words, the right to agree to disagree, is what drives this foundation of the BRICS, will that then become a value proposition that then becomes defined and perhaps even corralled in a way on interests? And so those are the dynamics and the nexus around how consensus moves to values, moves to interests. And do you then see that you're separating those 3 dynamics from each other? Because at the end of the day, I think the bigger challenge is really the nation state, the concept of the nation state and how the nation state is conceptualized, because the nation state is defined by these boundaries, by these interests, by sovereignty. And so you really have to start thinking out loud, what does this mean in the context of this kind of architecture? But having said that, I also think that when change happens, we're also very difficult to take change forward because we're so caught up in the static world that we live in. We're so caught up in the fact that this is the world we know. And so we find it difficult to see from some of the comments that are coming up in the chat and the Q&A that the BRICS is, and for lack of a better way, and with all due respect, I don't mean it disrespectfully, some may argue that the BRICS is a motley crew of countries that come together. And so they kind of can't understand what constitutes their democratic architecture, what constitutes a political system, what constitutes their consensus. But I think if there is a broad understanding, or if there's a guiding document on what consensus means, it will help. But I do think that down the line, these are going to become critical issues that the BRICS themselves will have to confront, if not already, by the fact that there are issues that will be non-negotiable for BRICS countries, and there'll be issues where they can negotiate on these things, whether it's on the peace and stability question. I think broadly, there'll be broad consensus on we need peaceful solutions to conflict. We need the UN to play a critical role. And if you go back and look at the declarations of the BRICS summits, there's always a consensus around the language of what they use. But as you expand, some may not agree with you. Others may disagree with you. And it can happen not just at the high-level political forum. It can even happen within the institutions of the BRICS, whether it's the academic forum, whether it's the think tank forum, whether it's questions around how do you see the role of women in business, the youth forum. These are the areas where, why I say this, Gustavo, is because if I look at the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, one of the things that's fundamental to that report in the next 2 years as a risk is social polarization within societies, that domestically countries are going through their existential crises. And we're finding it in South Africa as well. And so the age of conflict is actually also the age of impunity, but it's also the age of stagnation. And once you start reaching the age of stagnation, as we're seeing now with our socio-economic issues and challenges, we're going to have wage stagnation. We're going to have what they call compelled involuntary migration. You're going to have trade protectionism on trade agreements. And so you're going to start finding that domestic constituencies are going to disagree on certain things. So the high-level politics is one area of consensus. What happens when trade agreements or trade relationships are not working out, where it's benefiting one country and not the other? So the investment level at which the BRICS come together, I think, also requires us to be much more critical about what are the objectives of reform, whether it's the IFIs, whether it's the UN Security Council or the UN in general, whether it's the WTO, because the WTO is stuck in its context. So, and it's stuck in the DSI, in the dispute resolution system. So these are questions about which platforms are going to be consensus driven and which platforms are going to be much more critical on a BRICS perspective, on where do we all agree and take the necessary route. And I think climate change is one of those challenges for the BRICS.
Ambassador, let me bring you into Sanusha's comments. And I think, Sanusha, you mentioned something that I think is quite interesting, almost defining BRICS as a group that agrees to disagree. So to a certain extent, how much do you see, Ambassador, this continuation of consensus as a core pillar of processes within BRICS? How do you think this can influence agenda setting within the group, and particularly if you have a larger number of countries that are agreeing to disagree? If they are disagreeing more, basically you may narrow down the agenda even more. And I'm being somehow facetious about that. And bringing one of the questions that one of our participants brought, is there any discussions within BRICS this year to increase institutionalization of decision-making, but also in terms of creating more permanent structures within BRICS at the moment?
Well, let me start with the point that Sanusha made, and what was very clearly spelled out at the first Sherpa meeting in Russia. The major focus is to strengthen economic interaction. And I saw a number of questions. What's the value of being a member of BRICS to South Africa? What's the economic benefits? How does it percolate down to every South African? And we have seen, I mean, in 2013, our trade with BRICS, collective trade, was just over 300 billion. And by 2022, it was closer to 900 billion. So trade has grown exponentially. Investments from our BRICS countries continue to grow. Greater new investments are coming from BRICS countries. Technology, in terms of the field of technology, opportunities for our academics, for our students, the Young Scientists Forum. Number of our students are benefiting directly through projects and interactions. Our scientists, the Vaccine Research and Developmental Center, the agricultural track, some of the research that's being undertaken jointly there that benefits directly the farmers of South Africa. So the benefits are enormous. Let me not shy away from that fact. But very often we want to measure success in terms of just economic benefits, but it goes far beyond that. And one of the new tracks that Russia has put on the table now, and I think this is a welcome development in the field of technology, was to create a working group on AI. Now, this is a new area for all of us, but collectively, we have all been focusing on AI, including legislation around it and how we maneuver around the AI so that it becomes a powerful instrument for progress and change, and not used by a few, again, to ensure that they control the space. So in the field of technology also, there's been tremendous exchange and development, and we continue to expand in this. So I just wanted to address that aspect. Now, secondly, when you talk about BRICS, why the focus so much on strengthening economic interaction between ourselves and the global south and lifting ourselves? Because if you want to have an impact on the global political security scenario, you need economic clout. You need the finances to do that. China can only flex its muscles today as a major global power because of the size of its economy and because of its financial strength. Largest foreign reserves in the world today of about $3.3 trillion. That gives political strength to China. So BRICS, we recognize that, yes, as a collective, we have come together, we are strong as a political grouping, but we need to further deepen our economic interaction to strengthen our our economies domestically and also as a collective, so that the global south is not seen as weak anymore. Because if you continue to be countries that depends on handouts, you don't have any say in terms of determining the power equation. And that's why that economic clout, financial clout, translates into technological clout, because you have enough funds to pump into RD&I, and you also become a leader in technology. Technology is another space today that determines how the world evolves. And likewise, whether we like it or not, military power is still a major influence in terms of determining your space in terms of the global leadership. So all of these are dependent on having a strong economic base. And I think that's why we put so much of attention in that area. And as I indicated, the first BRICS Sherpa meeting, the Russian Sherpa made it very clear. Let us start focusing on deepening our economic interaction and strengthening that cooperation between ourselves. I think that is a very important point in terms of moving forward. And that's why with the changing dynamic and the changing weightage of BRICS in terms of the global GDP and the influence it has, and with the new members coming, I mean, if you look with Saudi Arabia, if Saudi Arabia does eventually join, just in terms of oil and gas, we will have close to 50% in terms of fossil fuels being held by BRICS countries. If you look at rare earth minerals, 70% is held by BRICS countries, the current 5, with China being the major shareholder of that. And all of these are going to determine how we move in terms of global interaction going forward. So BRICS has a number of strong points. But at the same time, what we agreed now at the first Sherpa meeting in Moscow, that the culture of consensus will continue to guide the way we conduct ourselves. And that has been the strength of BRICS. We do have differences, major differences on a number of issues, be it political, security, economic. But we always agree that we'll bracket those differences and build on the commonalities that we have. And what we find is the commonalities are strengths that we have that enable us to build and continue to become a cohesive whole in terms of impacting collectively on key areas. We all are not on the same page in terms of climate change, yes, but we have a working group. We do discuss these issues. And I think that's part of the strength, that we continue discussing and see how we can find common ground eventually, even on areas where we differ. And I think this is part of the strength of BRICS, is that we are a very robust group. We're very dynamic in our discussions. Nothing is off the table, even if it's something that irritates a member state, but we discuss it. And that's the culture that we have, the very open culture of discussions. And I think that has been the strength of BRICS. Our meetings are very robust, very often very heated in terms of defending your national position and in terms of projecting your interests. And that's what each one of us are there for. But as eventually, what is in the best interest of the collective going forward? And I think that even with an expanded BRICS, that will continue to be the strength of an expanded BRICS. Now, we'll not create a two-tier BRICS. Yes, you will have full members, and you'll have now what the leaders have tasked us to do is to look at partner countries. But what we are saying in terms of developing the modalities around that, we are all clear that the partner countries will be far more than the BRICS Plus or the outreach members that are invited. That will still remain in terms of engaging with the set of BRICS Plus countries or outreach countries as we do during the summits and foreign ministers meeting. But partner countries will have a far more substantive interaction with BRICS in a various number of areas. And these are modalities that are under discussion and will be taken forward now. We started our initial discussions in Moscow, but that will be taken forward so that we have a report in time for our foreign ministers and subsequently to take to the leaders going forward. So I am confident, yes, BRICS has challenges like any other group. We'll continue having these challenges because we live in a very dynamic world. And all of us, of course, will champion our national positions and safeguard our domestic positions while advancing what we would like to see as benefits from being part of this group. But at the same time, I think there is the common understanding that together we are stronger and that we can bring about change, which is not happening. I mean, you see it with the Gaza conflict and what is going on there. It's polarized the world far more. You see it with the ongoing Russia-Ukraine crisis and many other crises, including within the African continent and other parts of the world. Our established multilateral institutions are not coping with this because we have rendered the multilateral institutions almost semi-paralyzed. And that is why you would have seen that a common standing agenda item of BRICS is the focus on reforming the multilateral architecture. We had it last year as part of our theme, speaking of inclusive multilateralism. And this year, Russia's theme is also its theme is strengthening multilateralism for a just global development and security. Now, this is what BRICS has constantly been calling for. If you look at the very first declaration right up to the 15th Summit Declaration, a standard agenda item is reform of the global multilateral architecture, both the political, security, financial, and economic. And there's resistance to this. There's a resistance to this. And that's what we expect naturally. Those that are holding the levers of power will not want to share that with others. And yet the global architecture has changed. And this is what BRICS is pushing and pressurizing for going forward in terms of creating a more equitable global architecture.
Sanusha, I wanted to go to you now quickly, but just before I do that, I just want to ask a brief follow-up question to you, Ambassador. You spoke quite a bit in terms of the economic integration between BRICS members, and looking into the questions and the comments that are being presented here, I think there is a lot of questions regarding the more tangible aspects of BRICS cooperation in terms of the economics. And maybe if you could reflect a little bit more in terms of what are the current mechanisms, noting that BRICS is not a trade bloc, we don't have special tariffs between the members, and particularly if you could highlight a little bit in terms of what are the current discussions that are happening within BRICS in terms of issues around currencies, about local currencies, about common trade currencies, about digital currencies, and so on. And I think that would address some of the questions that are being presented here.
Well, look, let me start with a very practical issue. Imagine if there was no NDB. When we had the COVID outbreak, the NDB gave South Africa $1 billion as a loan to deal with the health challenges. That was in 2020. In 2021, we received another $1 billion to deal with the economic challenges arising from the COVID pandemic. Now, these are tangible benefits. We have, at present, South Africa has, I think, close to a dozen projects funded by the NDB, including in the energy sector, including in the infrastructure sector, and sustainable development projects. Now, this is the benefits of being a member of BRICS and having our own bank. It gives us this additional avenue in terms of sourcing finance to address our developmental needs. That's a very tangible outcome of being part of the BRICS. And you would have seen that just before the summit, we floated our first rand-denominated bonds on the South African financial markets. It was only the second. The first was in China. South Africa was only the second of the BRICS countries to have a bond in the local currency. And you saw that it was oversubscribed. The initial target was for 1 billion, but it went to over 1.5 billion. And that also is good for South Africa because now we can borrow in rands from the NDB. We don't have to borrow in dollars. Now, this is, again, the benefit of having the NDB. I'm just using that from the financial front. And as I've said, on the trade front, let me give you a very tangible example. We launched the Women's BRICS Business Alliance, the WBA, in 2020 virtually under Russia's chairship. Now, for the first time, the WBA could meet physically was in South Africa when they had the meeting here in KwaZulu-Natal on the 18th and 19th of August. And that brought together delegations from over 18 countries, not just BRICS countries, a large number of African countries, including from the Middle East. And at that WBA meeting, deals for over 150 billion rands were signed. These were tangible deals signed with South African business entities. And it was the first time the WBA met. Now, one of the targets we set for ourselves as key outcomes was to create a WBA Africa platform so that we create a platform for doing business with Africa for the African continent and especially focused on the MSME sector and women. Now, to date, 2 such platforms have been launched successfully. The WBA has launched a platform in Zimbabwe. You have a Zimbabwe chapter of the WBA, and they've done that in Zambia, and they're in discussions with several other African countries. Now, these are all tangible examples of how we're creating opportunities for our business sector, and in this case, women and the small business sector, to expand opportunities for us within the business sector, within Africa, and within the BRICS family. And when we were in Russia now, the WBA has an ambitious program this year in terms of expanding trade. Now, in terms of the BBC, now the BRICS Business Council was launched in 2013 under South Africa's chairship, and we celebrated 10 years of its existence. We have 10 working groups. Now, one of the things we are looking at is streamlining the working groups and make it more focused. But the BRICS Business Council is another very important avenue for our business to interact with the BRICS countries. And now with the expansion of BRICS, it gives us a bigger market, a bigger outreach. As much as these new countries will want to do business with the BRICS countries and see what opportunities that they can benefit from. But this gives us additional markets as well in terms of the new member states. And as I've indicated, these are, some of them are energy-rich countries. As much as we are talking of moving to green energy, the reality is we are still dependent on fossil fuels, and BRICS countries, as I say, are major players in this space. So as I've indicated, there are a number of positive, tangible benefits in terms of us being part of BRICS, but as I think it is equally important as a collective, BRICS has become a powerful voice on the global platform. You cannot ignore. Now imagine if there was no such formation as BRICS, what would you have on the global stage in terms of the context I've just outlined, where our UN system, our multilateral system is semi-paralyzed. They can't deal, the UNSC can't deal with the mandate given to them on peace and security because of the paralysis. United Nations Secretary General Guterres at the BRICS summit spoke of just how outdated the global financial architecture is, and the United Nations Security Council, that it is out of touch with the reality of the world, that both of them are archaic, outdated words that he used and irrelevant today. And this is what BRICS has been saying long before Guterres mentioned these words. We have been saying that our multilateral institutions are no longer fit for purpose. They're archaic institutions. They don't speak to the reality of 2024. And now imagine if you didn't have a formation like BRICS that brought together here at summit in South Africa over 60 countries, the whole of Africa, and another 20 plus from the global south. Why did all of them come here? Many at the level of heads of state. Why did they come to the BRICS summit? Now, if you didn't have this platform, what would you have? You'll still have your G7 articulating the interests of the G7 group and the developed world, and you would have the G20. And within the G20, you have a small number of developing countries. 9 out of the 20 are from the developing world. Now we have the African Union there. But who would champion as a collective and articulate in a powerful manner the concerns of the global south if you didn't have a BRICS formation? What is the other body that is there? Sure, you have your non-aligned movement, you have your G77 in China, but those bodies today do not have the clout that they once had during the Cold War era. They were a creation as a result of the Cold War dynamic. They have relevance, but they do not have that powerful, cohesive voice. It's the age of minilateralism, whether we like it or not. All of these minilateral bodies that are cropping up, whether it's the Indo-Pacific economic framework, whether it's a Quad, whether it's AUKUS, or whatever that's cropping up. We live in the age of minilateralism, and BRICS has become a powerful minilateral body to reinforce multilateralism, not to undermine multilateralism.
Sanusha, I wanted to continue with some of the points that Ambassador was mentioning now. And you mentioned something earlier that I thought was quite interesting, this idea of a BRICS-infused global order rather than BRICS being a dominant group. A lot of the questions that are coming through here, they are asking precisely about this global order and specifically this geopolitical nature of many of the discussions we're having. There's some questions here talking about the fact that the G7 often can speak with one voice on geopolitical crisis, which seems to be much harder for BRICS. So I think part of the question to you would be, can BRICS be a stronger voice in crises such as the war in Ukraine, Palestine, and other issues that we're talking about? There was another question here also asking about, in a geopolitical context, does larger members within BRICS, i.e. perhaps China, India, have more influence, and do they, and I'm repeating the expression that was mentioned here, do they use and abuse sometimes their power within that? And maybe turning around, what is the role of smaller countries like South Africa? There was one comment here, we may be perhaps the soft power within all of those. So I just wanted you to elaborate a bit more on that.
Okay, so I think on the term, the BRICS infused global order, I think, what the ambassador said, that the BRICS is a minilateral to strengthen the multilateral. And I think the realization for me is that the BRICS is not going to do the kind of it does do the saber rattling in terms of changing and pushing the envelope on issues and creating that kind of platform for recognition and no longer just knocking at the door, but created the institutions around, for example, the bank as a tangible outcome, which then raises questions around, this other point that came in the chat about the IFI reforms. And how that plays out. And your point about the currencies, I think the misconception that the BRICS has to create a single currency. It does not have to do that. It can change the instruments around trade and how it wants to trade. It's not necessarily saying we need to replace the dollar, but rather we need to look at what transactional value we can start creating as tangible outcomes that reduces transactional costs for the BRICS. And I think what was interesting, as an example, is the question of the use of currencies and local payment. It comes out as if we're waiting for a currency because we're so used to this world that has to be dominated in a particular way. And we're so conditioned in that world that everything has to be about the way, for example, power is defined around the financial architecture. And I love Susan Strange's conceptualization of the four structural pillars of power. The control of credit, the control of security, the control of knowledge, and the control of production. And those are the key pillars, I think, that we have to start thinking about. That's no longer valuable for the global South, because you want to actually start also having that structural power. So I think that a BRICS-infused world is really the question of saying, how do we get to a point where it's not just about getting a seat at the table? It's not just about, saying that we need to knock at this door and then let us in. But a BRICS-infused world is actually shaping the decision-making processes in those spaces, being able to bring that kind of decision-making in. And it doesn't have to be the BRICS only, because I think that's the misconception, that the BRICS is going to be the kind of be it all that's going to change the entire global system. No, it's not going to happen that way. Because if you look at the WTO, I think the smaller island nations have a bigger strategic value and way in which they influence, particularly in terms of the small island states, and they get what they want out of the WTO. And it's an interesting dynamic, because for a while, the WTO was actually about how mega trading blocs have become kind of characterizing the multilateral trading regime. But we now know that these are things that are becoming much more difficult to manage by the developed world, that these institutions are actually having a very interesting debate in domestic politics in these countries. And I think this idea of the BRICS speaking with one voice, I mean, yes, I think now maybe, some may say on the chat, Sanusha's changing her tune, but no, the point I'm trying to make is that you have to choose which of the issues you're going to go for, which of these issues are going to be critical. And you're starting off with the economic, and we've always started off with the economic, and we've moved towards the political. But the point about speaking with one voice, it doesn't mean that you have to have that one voice on every single issue. For example, in the WTO, South Africa and India were on the intellectual property rights, on the TRIPS and TRIMS, under the vaccine production, which China, I suspect, was on the other side. And to a large extent, this is where the issues, I think, need to be built into the BRICS around that criteria of consensus. Does the G7, and let me be a little bit facetious here, does the G7 really speak with one voice? Because right now, there's an interesting dynamic emerging across the transatlantic relations around this question about Israel and Palestine, where the EU head of the EU, I forget his name, actually raised the point when President Biden said, we must now do something about the military offense expansion into Rafah. And the EU said, well, if that's what the US wants to do, then they should stop selling arms or stop providing arms or something to that effect. So transatlantic relations are also not as cohesive as we think it is in the G7. There's now becoming an increasingly level of people may not agree with it. People may say, no, it's just one issue. But I think there's a bit of a interesting kind of coldness beginning to develop in the G7 around the particular fragmentation over issues. They're not speaking with one voice on particular global issues. They're not kind of coalescing on these things. They're taking different stances. The issue of Europe feeling as if now they need to build their agency, build their voice within the G7 is also interesting, and comes at a time where I think for the BRICS, it raises the question of, well, what does consensus mean? And how does this play out? But I do have one caveat to all of this. And the caveat for me is the UN Security Council reform, because you've got Russia and you've got China. Both are permanent members with veto power. If we are to see a consensus around the reform of the UN Security Council that essentially opens up the council to equitable distribution of power and decision-making, then the question is, are we going to see two of the BRIC members thinking about whether or not they want to give up that veto power, because then you've got to align to what your thinking is. Because in the sense, this question of veto, the question of the UN Security Council reform is a similar question, I think, that the G7 grapples with, but you've got 3 of the G7 that are permanent members in the Security Council. And so there's a number of debates that happen there. But I think that for now, the challenges are that the world institutional architecture is very fragmented. It's in a state of unraveling itself. There's no center to call. And so these are the dynamics we're going to find. And I think to a large extent, one of the more interesting reports or news items we saw last year, Ambassador and Gustav, was possibly some facetious reports suggesting, and being cheeky, that France wanted to attend the summit. So if the BRICS is open to the G7 members becoming members of the BRICS as well.
Sanusha, let me continue with
Actually,
sorry, go ahead, Ambassador.
France did formally ask to come to the BRICS summit. It was not just rumors. There was a formal approach to BRICS members, including South Africa. When the French foreign minister was here in July last year, she formally approached Minister Pandor that President Macron wanted to attend the summit. So there is already, I think, the realization by some members of the Common West or the Global North that you need to start talking to BRICS. You can't wash away the existence of BRICS and make as if they're non-existent, and a dialogue at some stage. And I keep reminding our colleagues, you see, when I was addressing a group of ambassadors last year prior to the summit, and this question was raised, how is it you, as South Africa, India, and Brazil, as dynamic democracies, how are you in the same bed with Russia and China that differ so vastly from you in terms of the government system? And I reminded them, it was an ambassador from Europe, that you don't ask this question within the context of G20, and yet all of you are in the same bed with Russia and China and other countries that are not democracies, that are G20 members, and you never ask this question. But why does it apply only to BRICS? You work very well with China and Russia. Otherwise, G20 will never be able to have the successful outcome document that you had, even under very trying conditions at the Delhi summit last year. And that's because all of us, irrespective whether we are democracy or not, we work together. So it works very well, as within BRICS, we may differ in terms of our systems of governance and value systems and political outlooks. But as I've said, there's a common denominator in terms of us addressing collectively the issues at hand.
I wanted to ask both of you the same question, but I'll give you, I'll ask you first, Anish, and then I'll ask Ambassador to give some final words. What are your expectations for BRICS in 2024? We have Russia with its presidency recently started, very large number of meetings, around 250 meetings, as we heard in the Sherpa meetings 2 weeks ago in Moscow. Some countries, including Brazil, very openly presenting that, well, we need to start considering whether we need that many meetings and whether do we need that many working groups. But for you, Sanusha, and then to you, Ambassador, after, what do you think should we be watching this year? What are the potential game changers? What are some of the things? How do we filter that noise? If we have 250 meetings within BRICS this year, perhaps some will be more important than others. Sanusha, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think firstly for Russia, it's going to be about the region, the Eurasian region. It's a critical pulse point for Russia, both economically, politically. It's a critical space for Russia to try and deepen its identity, deepen its engagements. And we're going to see that very much part of the kind of outreach that the ambassador spoke about, and perhaps even in terms of the substantive discussions that are going to come up with partner countries and in the model that foreign ministers are currently curating the discussion around and the document. I think on the issue of AI, as Ambassador said, very importantly, creating a working group on AI is becoming increasingly a fundamental global security question. It's not just about AI being so good for us in terms of technological change and the kind of advancements we make. But I think, one of the things that caught my attention in the chat was about space cooperation in outer space. And that's been a key question as well for Russia, for China, for many of the BRICS countries, and including their regional partners and more broadly in the international system, is how do we manage these spaces around the strategic interests of space cooperation and so forth. And in terms of the 250 meters, so for me, it's really 3 or 4 things that I think are critical. One is to have some level of institutionalization around how do you deal with the local payment currency system. We know that's working with regard to the UAE that has now joined as a member, and they have they have a bilateral engagement with India, and that has now been denominated in rupees in terms of transaction. And that's going to be key. So looking at that going forward, but also looking, and you mentioned this as well, Gustavo, you mentioned that there's no kind of tariff structure around trade, etc. But where does the trade cooperation seem to define itself in terms of the areas of sectorial engagement? The investment is important. The economic growth, economic cooperation is important. But I think there needs to be some kind of understanding as well in terms of some of the bilateral agreements that go forward, how they may complicate more regional agreements. And one of the key things for me in the context of Africa is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Given the fact that we've moved to ratification, the fact that South Africa has now moved towards the kind of implementation of parts of the agreement. But the real challenge for the agreement is implementation. That countries in Africa, the economies of scale are so small. So how does this then translate into tangible outcomes? How do we then also move, more importantly, in terms of the financial instruments, access to finance? Because again, in the current architecture of the global financial architecture, the ODA that we're speaking about, there's a shift in the whole kind of discourse, debate, and policy environment in countries that normally give traditional ODA, and that's going to change. And then the final thing I think is a consensus, a real interesting dynamic of a broad, even if it's a broad one that works towards a much more tangible outcome, is on climate change. So technology, climate change, because these are the key drivers for the future. And I think in the next cycle of the BRICS, these are going to be key game changers for the BRICS.
Ambassador, what are your thoughts? What can we expect? What are some of the highlights for BRICS in 2024?
Well, I think first and foremost, as we've seen, Russia has a very ambitious program for its chairship. They are putting a great deal of resources because I think Russia wants to demonstrate that despite the unilateral sanctions and some of the other measures taken against Russia by some of the countries of the global north, that Russia is still part of the world community and they're capable of delivering in terms of the mandate they have around BRICS. One of the key areas that I think Russia needs to focus on, and I believe all of us collectively, is to ensure that the new members are fully integrated into the BRICS family. I think that's a very important point because BRICS is a vast entity and our cooperation has developed over these past 15 years into over 20 ministerial tracks. So we must ensure that our new members of the family are fully integrated into all of the work streams and benefit equally from the cooperation that we have. So I think that has to be a major focus going forward. Then the 2 key areas that emanated out of the Johannesburg 2 summit that Russia must take forward and deliver on is, as I've said, on the use of local currencies and looking at payment instruments and platforms. That's a very important part of the work that has to be done collectively so that we take forward this issue of our financial options that we have as BRICS countries. And secondly, of course, developing modalities around the partner country category that was also mentioned in paragraph 92 of the Johannesburg Declaration. Now, besides that, of course, the Business Council, as I indicated, Russia is putting a great deal of emphasis on economic cooperation during their chairship. I think the two business councils, the Women Business Alliance, which, as I indicated, grew out of Russia's chairship in 2020, is on a good platform. But for South Africa to see that the platform that we have created under the WBA to ensure that Africa is an integral part of this, including the Continental Free Trade Agreement and opportunities it provides in terms of partnerships with BRICS countries through the WBA platform, and of course, further streamlining the work of the BBC in terms of its working groups and ensure that it takes forward the partnership for the BRICS strategy for economic partnership 2020-2025 that is there, which has to be driven by our Business Council. So I think that the other major focus area for Russia, which we have all agreed to, is the focus on infrastructure within BRICS countries. How can we collectively address and improve air, land, and sea connectivity and communication between BRICS countries? So this is a new area that will receive specialized focus during Russia's chairship, which is critical for all of us, and also the role of the NDB in supporting infrastructure built in all of the BRICS countries. The other area that will receive special attention, as I've indicated, is on the financial sector, including the digital economy. We have been focusing on the digital economy, and now also to bring on board the issue of artificial intelligence that Russia has brought to the fore. We want to also deepen the work around cooperation in terms of energy, including the green economy, and that's also a major focus area for Russia and also for all of us. So these are some of the critical areas, but not forgetting the soft diplomacy issues of people-to-people interaction. There's an ambitious program for our academics, for our students, as well as for our universities and think tanks, as well as the BRICS sports that is being arranged in June in Russia, where some 60+ countries are going to participate. Now, this is a massive sporting event. Some will say, well, because of the isolation of Russia from the global sporting bodies, that they have developing an alternative. But I think it's important for us as countries of the global south to also address bringing our people from the sporting arena together and giving them platforms. And just on a lighter note, Russia is going to have a BRICS Bread Cup. Now, where they're bringing all of our bakers and confectionery artisans together, and because they made a very important point. What brings communities together? It is bread. We all break bread together. I said that we have been breaking bread together as the BRICS family, figuratively, but now Russia is doing it literally, where you're going to have the bread cup. But these are some of the innovations to also bring our people together. And I think that's a very important dimension of BRICS cooperation, strengthening people-to-people interaction through some creative ideas other than those that are already well established.
Wow, we've been talking for an hour and a half already, and I guess time does fly when you're having fun. So, but I wanted to really thank you, Ambassador Suklov, and thank you, Sanusha, for really participating in these events. I think when we look into all of the comments and questions that were posed, it does show there is a lot of interest in BRICS, and I think it's something, at least from our side here at SIA, we'll continue working towards developing analysis, but also trying to engage in conversations like this that I think they really help us in better understanding what types of international relations mechanisms we are part of. and how can this benefit better countries like South Africa, but also all of the other countries that have joined. I wanted to also thank all of the participants for joining, for staying with us. We had over 140 people joining us here on Zoom and a number of other people following live on YouTube. I did try to infuse, and using Sanusha's expression, some of the questions within the conversation, and I hope that we covered at least most of them. Thank you for Ambassador and Sanusha for also checking the comments and questions and adding them to some of your comments. And from our side, just really thank you very much. And will be another very important year for BRICS. And I think it's very important for all of us to continue following these developments. Thank you very much. And until next time.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.